Welcome to Lancaster University's Data Science Institute. Can I just ask those of you just joining, if you would just turn off your microphones, please? That would be incredibly helpful. If you want to turn off your video as well, you can, but microphone's the most important thing. So my name is Karen Broadhurst, and I'm the co-director of Lancaster's Data Science Institute with my colleague here, Nigel Davis, who'll just give us all a quick wave. Thanks, Nigel. Okay, so we're absolutely delighted that you've joined us today. We are hoping to revert back to face-to-face events in the summer term, but we're absolutely delighted that so many of you have joined us, and I'm sure you're as excited as we are about this talk from our colleague today. Okay, so just for those of you who are not so familiar with the Data Science Institute, particularly external colleagues. So the aim of the DSI is to support interdisciplinary, data intensive, data relevant, data rich research, and to work collaboratively with our external colleagues, such as Sakthi, industry, public services, government and academic partners, to tackle contemporary issues, including data-driven challenges. So turning to health, we have our lovely colleague Bruce Hollingsworth here today, who's the theme lead for health, really critical role in the Data Science Institute, who's co-chairing with me today. Health has always been a really important theme within the DSI, but in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic and beyond, absolutely vital that the DSI supports health-focused work. So in that context, we're absolutely delighted to welcome Dr. Sakthi Karunanithi. I did check out the pronunciation. I hope that's near enough, Sakthi, who's Director of Public Health for Lancashire. Welcome, Sakthi. We're absolutely delighted to have you with us. I know you're working with a number of colleagues in DSI, and the work is incredibly rewarding and I think reciprocally fruitful for our region. So Sakthi is the Public Health Director for Lancashire. He's played a vital role, a leadership role, in steering the region's response to COVID-19, and he continues to do so as we move through this pandemic. So Sakthi chairs, among his many roles, the Joint Intelligence and Planning Group across Lancashire's Resilience Forum. It's a forum that plays a key role in monitoring the incidence rates of COVID, vaccine uptake, and many other issues that are absolutely vital as the region moves forward to reset and restore beyond the pandemic. So Sakthi has an impressive spread of knowledge, including epidemiology, health promotion, population health management, and of course, evidence-based health policy making. So the title of today's talk from Sakthi is Problem, What Problem? Perspective Taking Amidst Constant Change during the COVID-19 pandemic. So thank you, Sakthi. And on that note, I'll hand over to you. Sakthi will talk for 30 to 40 minutes or so, or however long you want. And then Bruce is going to chair some discussion and interaction. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Just give me a thumbs up. Yeah. All right, great. Well, what can I say? That's been a very kind introduction, and I'm delighted to be here, although remotely. I just wanted to approach this in a particular way. But before I do that, I just wanted to acknowledge everything that's gone on in the last couple of years and all the stresses and distresses and the suffering. I just wanted to recognize what everybody has gone through and continue to go through in some respects. And thank you to the university and the DSI for actually being supportive throughout. And Chris and John are on the call, and Bruce and I have had many conversations as well. I just wanted to say right at the front, it's been incredibly helpful in having that connection with the university. The other thing is that I'm probably not speaking here as sort of a technical expert, although I could go on about the EPI and so on. I want to take a particular view of the problem in hand from a broader perspective than simply a technical, epidemiological, or scientific perspective. I might veer into other realms of knowledge, including philosophy and problem solving, although I don't claim to be an expert in any of that. And this has come as a result of all the teachers really that I've had, and I just wanted to recognize all my teachers here so far and continue to teach me, and my partners and our partners beyond county council, district council, voluntary sector, hospitals. This has been a very intense period and continues to be an intense period, which I think none of us have experienced before. So I'm drawing on from all the experiences I've had, particularly in the last couple of years, from a number of perspectives, including my dealings with various national government departments. It's probably fair to think that public health involves all sectors, from environment to economy and education, but it's never been so intense and close contact with all those sectors. And it has indeed been very helpful in preparation for this talk. And I said I want to approach this in a particular way, and by that I meant just approaching the problem. And I want to draw on from my personal experiences, and hopefully that will be reflected in what you went through as well over the last couple of years, through the 4 waves that we've had, or indeed 5 waves. If you ask Chris and I, we have reasons to believe we have more than 4 waves, which I'm quite happy to indulge in a discussion. And each of these waves have taught me there are different facets of the problem, but one has been more predominant than the other. And whilst I am going to approach this with direct experiences from COVID, I think we've collectively learned quite a lot from the last 2 years, which is equally, if not more, transferable as concepts, as frameworks for approaching the problems in the future. And I would like to end this with a focus on so what, and particularly the focus on perspective taking, in the sense of you can have various perspectives about the same problem, and end my talk with what that actually means for us, certainly in my view for Lancashire, but it may well hold true for other areas, and indeed wider implications across the world. So that's my preface, if you will. I'm going back to February 2020 now. We have information that there's a new virus in the UK, a couple of cases in Newcastle, and at that point in time the location was not disclosed for very many reasons. And there was a lot of things that have been said, and it will probably be continued to be said in the future, but in terms of preparation, n number of exercises, plans written about the pandemic, and indeed we've had mini pandemics, shall we say, in the grand scheme of things, almost every 10 years. So it was a matter of orientating ourselves to what we were hearing and seeing, to what we've been through in the past. And hindsight always helps, but when we were in the middle of that situation, we simply couldn't have pictured the depth and the extent of what we are about to enter. And I think there is something there about history, learning and reminding ourselves often what's gone on in the history of humanity and where things could go wrong, particularly where there is an imbalance between nature and humanity in this broader sense, because at that time there was a lots of hypotheses about where this has come from. Is it a lab leak or is it something else? And particularly the idea that this is a zoonotic infection tells me something about what's happening around the world and how close we've come to in terms of wilderness and what implications there are for the future pandemics if we're not keeping that checks and balances in terms of interactions with nature. Anyway, that's the broader point. We couldn't have anticipated that. We could have anticipated, but we certainly didn't have ready-made plans to trigger that will come into action, which will address everything that we took for granted wasn't going to be there. Whether that is going round to the corner shop and buying a couple of loo rolls, or indeed going to work on the public transport, or indeed your own vehicle, and the ability to sort of travel across. Everything that we took for granted basically came to a halt overnight when we heard the Prime Minister declaring stay at home and save lives. Now, that poses a lot of issues in how a society runs, and indeed how every sector runs, and more importantly, implications for the economy, which often trumps many other dimensions in policy making. But we took the approach, and we could debate the timing of it and the effectiveness of that, and I'm not here pronouncing on what was right and what was wrong. I'm simply giving a description so that you get some kind of immersion of what was going on there. We were suddenly starting to see hospital admissions rising, and at that time we didn't have tests like we have now. And this is, I think, the work that Chris and others have been doing in the background actually was useful to know that we have something to base our anticipatory plans on. Hospital admissions was the only place that we could actually go to actually look for how severe the problem is. And there's something to be said about using hospital admissions and healthcare utilization as your marker for how severe the pandemic is, and our readiness to test widely across the community was simply not feasible. And it also meant that even simple things like visiting your mum or dad in a care home, or let alone care home, just neighbors, was not possible, or indeed it was illegal. We'll come back to the legality and illegality and who decides and who follows and how effective that was. I'm sure we can go into that. But the first wave was predominantly a shock. Everything ground to a halt, and we didn't have much to base our response other than what we just immediately faced with. Hospital admissions, deaths, PPE in care sector. This is where, when we were faced with that problem, understanding of the nature of the problem was really, really crucial. And our ability to understand, sadly, over the years, we become very siloed in how we train ourselves, how various disciplines work and how various sectors work. And this is where the general local resilience forum, the general emergency response plan, and particularly blue light services and military, ambulance services, police and military planning was so crucial in that to the scale that we've never done before, certainly in our lifetime. That also meant that there was a drive towards technical problem solving. So we shut elective procedures, we create capacity. All that mattered was we just need to make sure that the society doesn't go into a meltdown. Everything was shut, and there wasn't vaccine, there wasn't even widespread tests, there wasn't even the therapeutics that we have now. So it was purely just managing what was a rising consequence. We did that by developing shared understanding fairly quickly and started to speak shared language. And I think there's a really critical lesson there about holding on to language. And somebody mentioned linguistics before. The reason why I'm saying this is the meaning of various plans, the meaning of various understandings, and the ability to triangulate and have a shared understanding of the problem and to make decisions on in a good time has been a real challenge in the beginning. Wave one can be best described as a complete shutdown, and we just ducked and managed the consequences by simply throwing a lot of elective procedures, elective capacity out. But one thing that really stood out from an economic perspective was the furlough scheme. And I think it's amongst all the criticisms that we can make, all the options that we were facing were worse options or bad options. So it was a matter of choosing the least worst option in that situation, and actually being able to support people who were homeless, people who were furloughed, were really, really important at that time. And being able to reach particularly extremely vulnerable people with as simple things as food and medicines. And I want to pause there. There's an aspect of information sharing which still holds true. And faced with that crisis, by one way or the other, we found means to share information in a legal way between agencies. That meant crucial lifeline and support was possible. And I think we should be proud of that. All the foundational work that we've done over the years, particularly in Lancashire, on the data infrastructure, at least the concepts cleared, although we were struggling with sharing information beforehand. The background work, the thinking, and ability to share information, particularly to reach particularly vulnerable individuals, it was immediately possible for us because we already had the foundations to make that happen. The other important thing in that middle of a crisis, I don't know, there will be other places where people were new in posts and they were just coming in and facing this crisis. Thankfully, in Lancashire, there has been stability in people in roles in senior positions to actually look at each other and build on that already existing relationships. And that was incredibly important. And I think there is something there for me about leadership in a society, whether you're NHS or public, private, any sector, the relationship between people in leadership roles and a good relationship between people in leadership roles to be able to respond to any sorts of crisis looked to me and still appears to me as a fundamental thing in how we design and maintain and develop our public services. Now things started to ease, and particularly because people were following the guidance in spirit and in letter, and we could see the evidence through traffic mapping and police records and hospital admissions going down, and we were actually on the mend. But there came a little bit of a I would say pause, or the number of deaths were manageable, hospital admissions were decreasing, but we were starting to pick quite a lot of emotional sort of distress during that time where people weren't even allowed in funerals. And but I paused there because we we couldn't really do much on that front at that time. And many of us who were in the middle of, and many of you would have also experienced this, still hold that burden and the distress in us, especially during the latter stages of the pandemic, which I'll come back to that way. Then there was summer, and there were Eat Out to Help Out, various national policies, which put us in a different position in Lancashire, because when lockdown came in, we were slightly at the earlier stages of the wave going up, whereas in other parts, particularly London, this was pretty much full on, which also meant, and it is a controversial issue, nevertheless, I think it's important to share, when things started to lift, certainly from my personal perspective and professional perspective, we were having quite a high level of demand or level of burden at that time, which was mainly measured in hospital tests or pillar 1 tests, as we come to know about it. And then things started to ease. And in places like Lancashire, and there are other places across the country, where the fundamental social fabric is more face-to-face jobs, much more crowded housing, people who didn't have the facility to live in circumstances that would avoid transmission, I think came under much more risk, because there was a drive from moving from a technical fix and furlough and all the economic fix to more of a social, right, we need to look at this from a social an economic perspective, and we can't bear the scars of the economic slashes that happened in the first wave was pretty obvious. And then I am moving on from first wave to the subsequent waves now. The nature of the problem became not one of one solution for all, but one of tiering. And again, people may cast their minds back and remember which tier we were was the main policy agenda. And that also meant that there was more of restrictions than support, more of sanctions than support. And especially in communities where the social fabric, the structural inequalities that existed, what we really need and still need was more support and less sanctions. And that dynamic is still playing out in many forms. But then we saw the resurgence of infection, and it was more going towards Christmas and what was then called Kent variant, but Alpha now. It was mission basically save Christmas, which unfortunately couldn't be successful in the last year. At that time, we had so many other technical fixes. So test and trace were operational. We had a lot more tests. Didn't have lateral flow tests, but a lot more tests available. We were starting to think that we've seen the worst of it. Still, the impact was more felt on, or at least being seen as felt on health sector. And even at this point in time, although the head teachers and even university lecturers will be able to tell us that the impact on education and how much young people have been missing out, it was more of a medical fix for the pandemic and less of, well, we've got the technology, we can keep on going remote learning. But that was starting, and that started to raise its head, as in young people missing out. First whole year had gone as we moved into February, March 2021, and then we had a whole generation of young people, children from newborns to young people who had their major transitions. That impact started to become visible. But then the dashboards don't reflect that. I don't think it even reflects that now. And I bring it back to DSI to some extent in terms of intelligence and how we present information to understand the nature of the problem still is very relevant. But from a national perspective, it's still a health issue. It's more of an issue for Department of Health and probably HMT indirectly. And then almost every department would think, well, we're all right. We can bring back train journeys. We can bring back boxing matches. We can bring back rugby. Every sector you speak to would say, we don't contribute this. We don't contribute this to this pandemic. And it sort of became a multi-pronged from what was a single mission for the society to save lives, and everybody has shared understanding and their role, to actually the society started to, I wouldn't want to say diverge from the core issue that was in front of us, but it wasn't possible after a year to have the focus on a single issue. And I think there's something there about constant enduring stress in a society. For how long can you keep the attention of the public and the policy makers on a single issue? How long can you go with furloughing? How long can you go with remote learning? How long can you go without going through a football match? How long can you go keeping locking people and giving them fixed penalty notices? But we also had a massive technological breakthrough in that time with vaccines. Vaccines actually is a godsend. I think hats off again to the preparedness in the scientific community and sharing information and brought the vaccines. Things started to, so the backdrop for the problem is very different now than it was before, where it was more of a knowledge problem at the beginning to now more of a societal, social, more of a technical problem, a medical problem at the beginning. Although there were wider social factors playing out, we weren't actually focusing on that. But by this time, January, February 2021, vaccines there, right? Okay, we see the light at the end of the tunnel. There is a bit there. I use that metaphor advisedly. Whether that was a light or whether that was something else, only time in proper investigation will tell. But in my opinion, I think that was at least a heavy-duty truck and not really proper light. The reason why I say that, I do accept that hindsight helps, but it wasn't beyond understanding to think that this is just over. We were just beginning to get the vaccines in, but now the problem has become global. So vaccines in one part of the country doesn't actually solve the pandemic across the world. So the realization that what was national efforts, yes, there was WHO, and we will go back to all of that if there is time in the discussions, but that global coordination and all of that was certainly from a British perspective, it was a national issue. We sort it and get the vaccines, all great going. We are coming out. Now, the global dimension starts to arise now in the backdrop now, how important it is to share things where there may be problems. And this is where we start to get the Indian variant, the South African variant. There's lots of variants now in the picture. Now, intelligence, again, is really, really crucial here, because not every sample was genotyped, and we don't have a share or a distributed share of how that system works. And indeed, we were reacting to basically playing whack-a-mole. So this was the time where there was a variant, and we will do massive testing. We go after the variant almost inevitably. Before you actually find the variant, it's very prevalent there. Now, we've now got multiple layers of issues, from not really knowing much about this virus, to there is a technical solution going on, and then there's a societal behavior starting to change, and you need to understand that. And quite often we don't fully understand the public mood and attitude. There's something to be said about how do we understand public mood? How do we understand public attitude and cooperation? Is this just basically Google Maps and traffic maps? I suggest not. There's national work, but at a local level, I think we still need to think about this. So the layering of problems become really, really visible as you go through in time. Right, summer, all over again, 2021. At this time, we had vaccinated most vulnerable people really well, and I think we're proud in Lancashire to have done this really, really well. All the clinically extremely vulnerable, NHS pulled everything off, working with the districts, the voluntary community faith sector, and again, knowledge of what exists beyond your immediate organizational control has been very critical, and we often take it for granted, because all the voluntary community faith sector, they were there, but they were starting to be eroded over the last few years. But we somehow managed to reboot some of that. Summer variants, we have vaccinated the vulnerable and elderly, a large section of society, which is children and young people, not vaccinated. Summer break, schools come back. The whole nature of the problem changed from being just an NHS problem, and the trigger levels are all being set on the deaths and NHS admissions. And it still is an issue for us to understand where the center of gravity of this problem is. Now this is becoming a problem of children, not because children are being admitted in hospitals, but children are missing out on education, and almost, every other third school is having massive outbreaks. At this time, it was moving from working age elderly to actually college students, and as many of you will recognize that. And as time went on, the immunization caught up, and but now where it is, I'm coming to Omicron, and now where we are. I'm not sort of making a theoretical presentation of the waves technically, but I'm just trying to illustrate the nature of the problem and how it changed over time from elderly hospital admissions to summer 2021 and beyond, where it's mainly centered in younger population. Controversies, delays, I would rather boldly say, about decision making on vaccination. And what is important. So this is another point I really want to dwell on. As things started to gravitate towards young people, is the problem still an overwhelmed NHS, or is the problem that we're trying to solve different? How do we keep this dynamic understanding relevant and live, whilst still having common definitions of what COVID is and what a test is and what vaccines are, and so on and so forth? The problem now has become people, basically children, missing out on education, and as Omicron arrived, much more transmissible virus, it's become a workforce availability problem rather than a hospital admissions problem as such. The hospital admission problem will still remain, but the center of gravity of the pandemic has now clearly and visibly shifted from being a problem in the elderly and the vulnerable to actually becoming a problem of childhood and people missing out on education. And we are close to 2 years. Well, we have already crossed the 2 years limit, but we are closer to the lockdown anniversary. Now there's 2 years of 2 generations of young babies reaching nursery age, and the younger group reaching school age coming September. We've stored up quite a bit of developmental issues, mental health issues. I'm not even going into the domestic abuse and various other wider societal problems that have cropped up now. So where are we now? We have the problem of decreasing cases in Omicron. We also have a problem of increasing cases in Southeast and Southwest. But the risk and threat is less on lives and more on our access to education and livelihoods, rather. So the rules to solve these problems of self-isolation and contact tracing and all the testing has become less and less and less relevant as more of the populations become vaccinated and the public mood and compliance with the legislation changing into one of more of a nuisance, one might want to call it, but I'd also want to add one of potential negligence in terms of understanding the nature of the problem and therefore bringing solutions to address that. Now, that is pretty much a very COVID-centric view of the 4 waves from where it began to where we are now. I don't think we'll have time to describe the wider societal impacts, which can't be underestimated. As much as we were tracing contacts, we have also been tracing the contexts, and that is incredibly important as we look forward. At this point in time, it's now a technical sort of epidemiological problem, a societal, a behavioral layers added on, economic issues added on, the burden, the carrying the public confidence and trust has become an issue. And obviously, I'm not going into other events that are happening around it. We've exited from the European Union during the pandemic formally. We've had storms, we've had wildfires, we have had a number of things, including what appears to me as a political crisis at this stage, where we are just hopefully about to exit and we are sort of going for the landing gears, and we just need to make sure that we land safely to live with COVID than just land at any cost. And I just want to move towards the conclusion of my input. The importance of drawing from various disciplines in problem solving, especially societal problems, even though they may appear as a healthcare problem. All the ologies you can think about, anatomy, physiology, sociology, psychology, economics, philosophy, directly or indirectly, they have all been drawn on in understanding the problem and making decisions. But I reflect back, and even my own training, I don't think we train people, or not, neither is it possible to educate people in all the ologies in this era. That tells me something about there's an implication there for training our future public sector leaders or people in leadership roles in general. The second thing I want to draw on is the role of intelligence. I mean, intelligence is not just information sharing, it's understanding the meaning and it's building on the knowledge, and actually that needs to have a shared understanding, and we can debate about, do we now have a shared understanding of the pandemic or not? It's a separate discussion, but what was a shared understanding before that could kill you and you need to stay at home, to actually everybody having their own understanding of whether this is mild or seasonal, and vaccines are a faff, and everybody has their own understanding. But the role of intelligence and the role of information and how we take it to the public, let alone how we connect our organizations to make decisions, it's fundamentally taught us a lot of things in there. And I genuinely believe institutions like the DSI, working in partnership with the public sector, we need to hold on to the learning from that perspective. The role of engagement with the communities, and what is the message, who is the messenger, what's the medium, has never been more closer to us, and certainly to me personally, than ever before. Importance of media, importance of all the channels and TV, radio, as sources of information and intelligence. And I want to finish with the role of leadership and role of leadership, people in organizational leadership roles. Now, we have, it's not uncommon for us to understand leadership as a personal trait or personal character and personal behavior, but it is increasingly also being understood as actually leadership is leadership only happens in a social context. You can't just sit there in your room and think that you're a leader. That brings to the fore the importance of the knowledge of somebody in a leadership role and their character of somebody in a leadership role, whether you're a technical leader, organizational leader, political leader, and all of that. It really has brought to light, and there will be lots of global analysis already on this subject of role of leadership, and particularly role of leadership in perspective taking, by which I specifically mean being open to listen to differing diverse perspectives, from a philosopher to an epi expert and a data scientist, and being able to not just analyze but synthesize that knowledge. I think there is a particular domain there this pandemic has taught us, in terms of the role of leadership in actually synthesizing knowledge, and actually also role of leadership, or the role that the character of an individual plays in how one practices leadership. I don't think we have a curriculum for that. Somehow we've lost it. Is my personal opinion, in terms of the character building in crisis and how that comes in. The final remark I'll make, and then we can have hopefully a live discussion, is I think this has got implications in terms of how we teach the next generation of public sector, teach our young people mainly, in how do they distinguish between the truth and the misinformation and disinformation. How do we train our next generation that don't just become experts in small part of a problem, but actually being able to see the whole problem in itself. And I'm not certain if it is just in the political domain. I do think there is something here about professional training before we have disciplinary training. There's some pre-disciplinary work that I think there's an implication in helping people understand how the world works and how do you make decisions before knowing everything. So that's the phrase. I think it still sticks with me. How do you make decisions before knowing everything? And can you know everything? You can't, but can you surround yourselves with people who may know most of the things? I think you can, but that only happens if your perspective taking methodology, i.e. more diverse, more inclusive, more prepared to listen, even in the crisis, actually can be manifested. And pandemic might have brought us together, but the nature of the problems that we're going into, it's more possible, more likely that the shared understanding and the shared goal of a society is going to be not there. And how do we actually understand what our shared goal is without having a shared perspective of the problem is where I'd like to sort of conclude. And by saying that in any problem that we have tackled so far, and certainly the learning from the pandemic, two things come to mind. One is understanding where we've come from and where we are now and where we think we're going. So that's one dimension. And it is incredibly difficult to achieve by a single individual or even by a single organization. Where have we come from? What's the context now and where we are going? It's at different geographical level, different communities. There is one thing that the pandemic's taught us, where keeping it together, enabling shared understanding and being able to talk about the differences is feeling incredibly important to me. The second dimension to the problem solving for me is this is not a problem to be solved. This is a problem to be managed. And the very solution that was the solution at the beginning of this problem, which is lockdown, is actually a problem now. So there is something about this being an infinite loop in my mind, and it remains a paradox. There is a paradoxical perspective here for problem solving, where the very thing that was the solution at one time will become a problem at another time. And having your sensors and having the intelligence about when that balance is about to tip, and to understand the public mood, and trying the rhetoric and persuasion and the importance of that can never be underestimated. So it remains a triple logic with an infinite paradox for me. The triple logic being the history and the context and the anticipation, and how we use intelligence for that. And then the infinite loop being, how can we understand the very solutions are becoming a problem, and try and shift to a different sort of way in not trying to solve the problem, but there are many problems in the society that cannot be solved but can be better managed. I'll leave it there, Karen. Thank you again for asking me to be with you. I don't claim to be an expert on anything now, so if I have offended somebody by speaking something out of turn, I apologize, but I'm just giving you a common man's perspective of problem. What problem? Thank you.
That was absolutely fascinating. It was just so interesting and such incredibly wise words. Can I just ask everybody to just turn the microphones on and just give you a clap? Thank you. Okay, microphones can go back off. Thanks so much, Sakthi. I mean, I was gripped by the whole talk. It was amazing that you could engage us without even any props or any slides. So very, very, very engaging, lovely talk. And we've got lots of comments in the chat, and I think I'm going to hand over to Bruce now, who's going to pose some questions. There's lots in the chat, Bruce.
Thank you.
Going back up to Emma Halliday, I think.
Yes, I think we'll just dive in with some questions. Sakthi, are you happy with that? And we'll maybe start.
Yeah,
Emma's the first cab off the rank, I think. Well done, Emma, for writing the first question. One of our wonderful public health researchers, of course, who I'm sure you've come across. Emma, do you want to read your question out or talk, or do you want me to read it out? Obviously, you'll have to talk to answer that question, won't you? So anyway, over to you, Emma.
Yeah, so you can see in the chat, I mean, I was reflecting on some of the work we did with VCFSE organisations during, oh goodness, maybe between the first and second lockdown, and reflecting on their experiences of working together and also then working with sort of agencies. And I think one of the findings was that they felt that within themselves they were kind of working a lot more closely together and wanted to kind of try and sustain that, not, you know, notwithstanding challenges that you've talked about, Sakthi, but obviously there were still challenges with working with sort of statutory organisations, and often that sort of happened mainly where those relationships were already in place. But one of the things I suppose from that was that there was a real appetite to think about how we can sort of sustain the positive changes around sort of sharing of knowledge and data and relationships. And I just wondered if you had any thoughts or reflections on how you're thinking that can sort of happen in Lancashire and South Lancashire.
Yeah, so if I understand the question right, Emma, so how can you sustain this level of engagement, voluntary commitment, faith sector, including information sharing in the future? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so these ways of working which have perhaps broken down barriers a bit.
Yeah, I mean, crisis actually breaks down barriers. That's what's happened in my experience. The level of trust between the groups. So I use the word groups advisedly. When I say between the groups, I mean different sectors and different groups. The level of trust between the groups at the time of crisis appears to me to have increased. Sudden rise in compassion. I don't know whether it goes up with the trend in the infections. It seems to have really increased, and I think there is a lot written about this, and I claim no deep knowledge, but it also goes down quickly, is what really puzzles me. The people that we work so closely together in reaching communities appears to become distant as we come through this pandemic. I think this won't happen by default, is what I would say. This will only happen by design, and we are blessed. We are blessed with such a wonderful voluntary community and faith sector in our county and generally in our society. But the importance of investment can't be underestimated, and the importance to voluntary community and faith sector. I think we do have a problem in terms of how we really address the polarities that we find ourselves in. I can't easily expect a clinician to refer a person to a voluntary community faith sector with them thinking they are almost equal to me. I think there's a problem in terms of power and trust between groups. And I think it's a very difficult question for me to immediately answer, but one that we are committed to as a system, ICS and local authorities and all of us. We need to get better in basically getting more income into Lancashire through various other programs of work. And you know that we have done some work together, and hopefully that will continue. I'm sorry, I'm sort of probably beating around the bush, but in summary, I think during times of crisis, we seem to have connected better, paradoxically. And when there is no crisis, we seem to have become a bit more fragmented, and it needs to be solved by design, and it won't happen by default.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next question is from Odette Dewhurst. So Odette, I'll give you a second in case you want to come online and ask it. There's Odette.
Yeah, thanks, Bruce. Thanks for that, Sakthi. It was really good. My question relates really to your appearances on BBC Radio Lancashire with Graham Liver, and I know quite a few people, including my parents, really looked forward to hearing from yourself around that. Do you get a sense of how well received that was in terms of, go back to the trust idea and having you speak to people and answer questions? Do you get a sense of how much that increased people's sort of trust and understanding of what messages were coming out and helped reach people who perhaps would struggle to be reached otherwise?
Yeah, I mean, I've never done that kind of program before. I was trained with media interviews, as many of us would have. It certainly gave me, it still gives me, I'm still doing that every Wednesday around 7:45. It is a really good channel to understand public mood and public questions. Obviously, there is a demographic that's attached to particular channels, and I don't know whether people feel more closer or people feel more trusted, but certainly some of the feedback's been having you say what's actually happening in Lancashire and being able to answer sort of real world questions, and not just on the radio, but being able to follow it up. Certainly, yeah. I think has built the trust with our local radio station and the public health team, I think.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Karen, you were next in the queue with your question.
Thanks, Bruce. So my question, Sakthi, I'm not sure whether you can answer this or not, but obviously we know that there were many societal health challenges pre-COVID. We know that COVID's added to those and created some new challenges as well, some distinctive new challenges, particularly I think around children's developmental delay and emotional impact. Well, you as a public health expert, though, in given that we're in straitened times, we've got a limited pool of money. Where should we invest first? What should be our priority? It's a really difficult question because obviously all of the issues are pressing, whether it's housing or children's development. Where would you start?
Thank you, Karen. I have kind of we have got an answer for that. Yes, it is a difficult one to answer, so I'm not sort of making it on the hoof. We've been thinking about this as a team, as a system, as an organization, and actually we chose three things. We have chosen three things as immediate priorities as we come out of the pandemic. And I don't know if you're pleased or not, but the first thing we chose is the best start in life. So the first 1,001 days, which people will be crossing if it goes on like this for another year, is the most crucial time in anyone's life. We have evidence to suggest that, not just our belief. So that is one thing that we have already started to address. The other thing is mental health, including in children, particularly in some households which are poorer households, or households where parents have been constantly working, have become an issue, and that includes domestic issues, domestic abuse, and all of that. So those are fundamental first priorities, really. There's an N number of other things in terms of recovering services, including waiting lists and all of that. There's a huge emotional, I don't know whether to call it PTSD as such, but there is a heavy emotional burden in the society that needs to be addressed. Some people call it moral injury and distress. I think that's definitely something I'm sensing.
Yeah, no, that sounds really good. I mean, I've been, a lot of my work actually has been looking at the sort of doubling of rates of infants coming into the care system and family breakdown around infancy. So it's good to hear that, but also the mental health burden through my work is, we're seeing major issues around mental health that have been there, but they've kind of got a new twist to them. Yeah. I think PTSD is a really helpful way of framing some of this. Particularly people who've perhaps been experiencing anxiety pre-pandemic have been quite traumatized by this period. Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. There's a couple of, several people have made the point of, and like the point about, Sakthi, you've been a kind, knowledgeable and sane voice in these stressful times. So I just want to acknowledge that as well, the point that people are making. Thank you. Next question is Rebecca Mead. I'll just give Rebecca a minute in case she wants to come online, or I'll just read it out for everyone.
Hi, Sakthi. Thank you so much for your talk. I really enjoy listening to you speak because I love how you complement the technical side with the kind of softer relational and leadership skills and things that are required. I always enjoy that when you're speaking. My question's about social inequality. So we know that it's been exacerbated during the pandemic, and that at the local level there's been a lot of really good work in addressing some of the unequal impacts. And I wondered what was happening now to try to harness some of the emphasis that's been gained and trying to mainstream that into ways of working across the system, and not just in relation to COVID.
Yeah, that's a really, really important problem that we have now. It has been worsened during the pandemic. You could look at it with a number of optics, from an BAME optics, from a social deprivation angle. I was just looking at the some of the key markers like life expectancy and healthy life expectancy. Actually, it's going down in Lancashire, I'm sad to say, and the gap between more deprived and less deprived has actually widened. How we address that? Well, we need to first acknowledge that, and I'm not quite sure whether it is fully acknowledged to start with. We come at it from a particular. We are really good in analysis of the problem, and hone in on a small part of a problem that might appear like the problem in itself, and sort of addressing that, whether that is more mobile vans in a deprived area for vaccination, or indeed a temporary solution for people who are homeless, for that matter. The data suggests, and I'm preaching to the converted here, the data would suggest that what we describe as improving health outcomes and the social inequalities actually doesn't, the solutions doesn't lie in just the NHS. It lies way over and above the NHS. There are opportunities. We have Professor Sir Michael Marmer in Lancashire and Cumbria, actually helping us gather evidence and understanding good practice. There is the program, as you know, the ICS development. Actually, one of the only four overarching outcomes in this national NHS reforms is reducing inequalities. So I take some hope from that. And then there's an increasing collaboration between the public sector, between the local authorities. I know there is a levelling up strategy that's being launched, and but there's not much new in that. But I'm actually hopeful that we will at some point. And this is the problem. This is the social inequalities problem runs more than 300 years. If you look in, there was a Cambridge University article I was reading the other day. The inequalities is not just the problem of this century or the last century. It's run through centuries. So we need to acknowledge that. We need to acknowledge the reality as well, that it's not going to just suddenly disappear without intentional investments that is particularly aimed at reducing the gaps. And I don't think that we're there yet. If that's my realistic assessment, there's a long way to go.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Rebecca, for the question. Inequalities is it's interesting, isn't it? I liked your answer at the end about managing things. And of course, inequalities are relative. They're always going to be there. It's not an absolute. A lot of these things aren't absolutes, are they? Sabia asked a question which might be more for Nigel or someone on the university management side of things. In terms of support for universities and students in helping post-COVID recovery. Sorry to put you on the spot, Nigel, but no. So, Sakthi, do you know of any local interventions to support university students in post-COVID recovery?
I'm more than happy to further follow this up. We have been working with HEI. There's a group for HEIs, and then also colleges where this has become an issue in the last sort of 3-4 months. We are working very closely with the NHS to make sure there's crisis support, but the issue appears to be not the crisis, and it's not very low level either, and it's really affecting the running of the classes and everything else. And we don't have professional support to meet the demand. So it's a problem, and that hence the reason why, along with Best Start, Better Minds or Healthier Minds is another one for immediate action. So yeah, no, there's no immediate solutions. We are putting plasters on it at the moment, but we need to sort of grab hold of this, and opportunities to collaborate. I'm always welcome, Sabia and indeed Nigel.
Thank you.
Sabia, did you want to follow up?
No, that's just really great to hear. And I suppose, I was kind of reflecting on the point that you made around the best start in life is important, but that kind of journey onwards. And I guess I'm particularly interested in the transition to university, which is a big milestone as well for prospective students, not least the kind of impact on the students whilst they're still here. But and I completely recognise all the points that you mentioned in terms of where the gaps are in NHS services. And I think I would love to have a follow-up conversation around how we can better plug that to meet some of these mental health needs that our students are experiencing. Thank you.
Definitely. Just would like to sort of recognise again, I think we are working very closely with the University of Mental Health First Aid. You provide a lot of training for schools and colleges, particularly from a suicide prevention perspective. So yeah, happy to pursue this conversation outside.
Thank you.
Now, the next question was from Karen, but she's already had one go. But she did talk. We'll maybe come back to talk about leadership, Karen, in a moment, because I think other people have mentioned it. Is that okay?
Yeah, that's absolutely fine.
Thank you. Thank you. So Russell mentions about, he says, representing the community this afternoon, we've suffered from information overload. Russell, would you like to follow up on that?
Yeah, certainly will. Hello, Sakthi. Fabulous presentation, as always. As you know, Sakthi, I'm the CEO for the National Forum for Health and Wellbeing, and the members that we have, which are many thousand, we take health advice and awareness direct to the public via health mailers. And what they've been suffering from is information overload. And I'm sorry to say, delivered often by the wrong person. We could do with more of you, that way that you can speak to us in that kind of language we understand. And it's not, next slide, please, and more graphs and more fear. I do appreciate that, you know, there's a few ways to nudge people into doing things, and fear is a good one. I think another comment I'll have to mention that the pandemic's highlighted to me, and it comes down to your pinned tweet about the dying, and how they often say that they wish they'd have spent more time with their family and hadn't worked as hard. I think the pandemic's been a game changer for that. I don't know what you think, but at least for a lot of people, it's reminded them as to what's important in life. And I think we're going to see a change going forward. And finally, your comments about the young, my goodness, that is so true. My granddaughter was born and has grown up in a pandemic world, and I have other grandchildren that have actually been suffering from their mental health because they've been seeing their friends on Zoom in the classroom. And when they're sort of 7 years of age and you're telling them to wear masks and stay inside and everything else, I wonder what effects it's going to have on them in the long term. Thank you.
Absolutely. I mean, there are lots of things that we still don't know about, Russell. We still do not fully understand how this pandemic has actually impacted us. We know how it affected the NHS. We know what we can do with vaccines and technology and tests, but actually the social side of things, I think it's got, well, for once, technology. We wouldn't be having this kind of Teams meeting, I don't think, if it wasn't for the pandemic. On the other hand, technology has got its disadvantages, I would say, particularly social media platforms where people can be forgiven to be confused with what is truth and what's not the truth. And I don't know, I think we've let ourselves into a bigger problem here. And I'm not quite sure what is the answer to that, which again takes me back to, we somehow need to bring back thinking on our own feet and thinking, not just believing everything we hear. And say, I think that's the skill that we've lost. Well, I might be wrong, but the impact on children, I don't think we fully understand, Russell. I do not think we fully understand what the impacts of the lockdown and all the issues are for the children who were born in the last couple of years. I think there's a PhD or a long-term cohort study in there, hopefully grounded in the community. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, information overload. I recognize what you're saying. Just on that point about the dashboards, I do have something. We don't. I mean, Chris might kill me. Well, the dashboards, do they really present the whole problem? I'll leave it there.
I think that's another talk in itself. Just moving on to the questions. Jim Wood asked a question about, do you feel the UK's complex local government structures have served us optimally in the pandemic? Jim, would you like to follow up on that? Or
no, just aware that okay. NHS is a national organisation, but when it comes to social services, housing, transport, particularly things like waste disposal, which is critical when we have a pandemic, then the pattern is much more varied. We have Lancashire here, and I can see the map behind you there. And, you know, we have a couple of enclaves within the county boundaries of Lancashire with unitary authorities. Very many functions carried out at different levels in different places. Is this the best system of local governance to achieve what we need to achieve when we are faced with a crisis like we have been faced?
Well, okay, Jim, I'll give you my straight answer, which is something that, you know, you would expect me to have thought about. I would say this: it's important to know, in ideal circumstances, what's the best regime of local democracy is. But we all know that circumstances are not always ideal. So in less than ideal circumstances, what's the way that we can have the best regime then becomes the question. But I think we've gone past that to say, how do we address the less than ideal circumstances and less than ideal regime? And that's where I think we are. But I don't think this is just a matter of structure. You can redesign local government or public services in n number of ways. I think it'll come back to the vision, the shared vision in a society, and how members of the society choose to be governed. I'd probably leave it there, Jim. It probably would be inappropriate for me to go into the politics of whatever you've mentioned, but there is no single. I don't think there is a single solution to this, and we are seeing something over the border in Cumbria. I do think that the balance is not there in terms of the local and the national. And going back to, this is not a problem we can solve, but we can manage this problem if we know where the pivot points are. And I think it needs more local governance and more local leadership and more local ownership than being dictated as from wherever it is, from outside the local.
Thank you for that very reflective response, very much in light of your overall presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim.
Okay, thanks, Jim. Now, David Parks has asked a question that would take me a long time to read out. David, would you like to come on and summarise your question, please?
Yeah, it's probably better rather than reading the whole paragraph. Hi, Sakthi. Yeah, so I wanted to ask a question which is not specifically about COVID, but kind of more generally deals with this idea of like really interdisciplinary, across groups type collaboration, which COVID necessitated, or at least necessitated strengthening. This idea of issues which cut across science, across public services, governance nationally and locally, all of these different groups. Now, I see parallels with that and have done through a lot of the pandemic between sort of addressing COVID as this inherently collective problem and addressing a lot of environmental issues as also kind of inherently collective problems, because I'm an environmental scientist myself. So I was wondering if there are any kind of tips and tricks that you've kind of learned through this process of establishing this more interdisciplinary approach, which you could maybe then apply in other fields, as a sort of model for other scientists or public servants who want to establish that type of collaboration in new fields.
Yes, definitely. I mean, I wouldn't say this works everywhere in every circumstance, but my view of the world, if you will, David, is one of an ecological view of the world. So it's just really being appreciative of the ecosystem in which everything else happens and understanding that everything is connected with everything else. Although for the sake of ease, we've sort of become so siloed. The best example I could give, certainly from the last couple of years working the pandemic, is the one that I probably would have never experienced this if it wasn't for the pandemic, is working with the military planners and indeed all the blue lights. It almost took me into reading various NATO doctrines, collaboration and joint action, and it's a statecraft is what I would say. But the model would be, and I'm beginning to think about this, happy to extend it outside. I think there is something about knowing. So, okay, let me rephrase it. There's something about evolutionary and the logic in how we've evolved from where we are to where we are. So where we were to where we are. So the evo logic in my mind. And then the second thing is about the current ecosystem. So ecologic. Understanding how things are connected. And then there's more fundamental thing about ego, whether that is an individual ego or group ego or organizational ego or societal ego. So ego logic, if you combine those three logics, that's the best way to understand a problem, certainly from my experience. And then you go into an infinite loop of paradoxes where you just need to immerse yourself in the situation and find solutions. But fundamentally, an ecological perspective is what has helped, I think, many of us throughout.
That's really interesting. Gives me something to ponder. Thank you.
Thanks, David. The next question is from Alan Beattie, who says he's shy of visuals. So I'll ask Alan's questions for him. He said, as a long retired academic activist in public health, I wonder whether the curricula and discourses about complexity theory, soft systems and paradigm dialogues developed in the last 30 years are useful in managing the problematics of public health in the COVID era. There's lots of words in there as an economist that I don't understand, so over to you.
Well, I don't claim to have that long an experience in academia either. But what I have learned, particularly in the complex theory, soft systems, paradigms, paradoxes, really is from the systems theory and the network of networks, and more recently, understanding the group life better, and that works at different levels, particularly taking some of the things I've experienced through NHS Global Health Leadership Initiative from Yale University, is this perspective taking and how we teach perspective taking in various curricula and discourses. Essentially framing. You can frame the problem as an individualistic problem, or you frame the problem as a group problem, or somebody else's problem. I think we are beginning. That certainly has helped. Certainly has helped a lot of us in the rhetoric about how do you explain things differently to different people. I think I can also see that in the way our behavioral campaigns have evolved during the last 2 years. But I genuinely do believe that the way we train our, not just the public health professionals, I do think there is something in there about the curricula, about how we train, particularly people who may be thinking about future leadership roles in public sector. There is definitely something that is in there that I can't quite sort of describe what it is, but it is about going a bit pre-disciplinary. I don't know whether, well, I know that we don't go into literature in medical courses, for example, or indeed linguistics, or indeed environmental sciences in any detail. I think there is something special about the curriculum for people who may end up in public sector leadership roles that we need to think about, transcending about all the ologies and isms, and train people. Training, this is not nature. I don't believe in this nature sort of thing. Yeah, there is nature, but it is also nurture. We somehow need to train future generation to make decisions without knowing everything, but having an appreciation of everything. And I don't know how, but if the universities, who are homes to all these disciplines, can't, I don't know who else can.
Good point. Yes, there's a point after that. Thank you for the question. There's a point after that from Chris Jewell about who's obviously worried about becoming a Yorkshireman. So we'll leave that and move on to Nick King's question about digital strategies. Nick, did you want to make your point? Or
Certainly. Hi, Sakthi. Nice to see you. And sorry you can't see me. I'm sparing you a cat sat in my lap at this moment in time. Yeah, so in the industry, we've seen digital strategies leap forward due to COVID, and not that we would have wanted it that way, but it's been seen, and a lot of strategies have moved forward. We've estimated about 4 to 5 years as justifications for greater connectivity have naturally been put in kind of stark highlight. I know, we've chatted a lot around interoperability and LPRES and connectivity. Have you seen that same sort of shift within the NHS, within how things are justified, business cases, and would you expect to see this, a kind of an increase in the expenditure in terms of relevant digital investment?
Yes, I think so, Nick. Yeah, nice to hear your voice after a long time. Yes, I do think so. I think that there is a few things that we've learned. Is one of that is how do we really maximize the use of digital technology, but we need to put some safeguards and guardrails around not sort of widening inequalities, but certainly digital technology has an immense role to play, both at an individual level, but also at a societal level or a group level. Interoperability and all of that at an individual level really be important. But nesting that within the ecosystem of an individual, the town or the home, the weather, the crime, I think we've talked about this on a few occasions. This is now I think this will now definitely have more traction with the way that the national policy is moving in population health management, for example. Yeah, we do still have a problem in the sense that it still remains within the Department of Health sector. So unless this silo is broken, I think the technology will be there, but we won't use it.
Absolutely. No, thanks, actually. Nice to see you again.
Okay, thank you, Nick. Chris, did you want to jump in about any points about them? I mean, you were making a serious point, I think, as well, about health records and obviously boundaries moving affects this sort of issue.
Yeah, just really quickly. Thanks very much for the talk, Sakthi. That was super interesting and gave me an insight into a much wider activity than what we've been able to discuss. But I think the point about this kind of clearing red tape out of the way in order to share epidemiological data is absolutely key. And I really hope that politically, one of the things that the country as a whole learns from this is that actually sharing data in the health space can actually ultimately benefit public health, and people shouldn't be quite so scared about the potential for records being linked. It really does have a tangible benefit. And yeah, the comment in the chat, just to explain that, is I'm a spatial statistician, and it's important that health records come in fine spatial detail, as nicely demonstrated by your backdrop, Sakthi. The different colours, I think, are the different local authorities. The move towards kind of amalgamating these local authorities and centralizing administrations into rather wider areas, I think, destroys the ability to kind of act in that very local way that you mentioned earlier. So that's definitely something that I worry about in my career, but I worry about public health more generally.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. I mean, even you only have to look at the budget of the ONS in this. We certainly need to democratize data. I think if there's one thing that the pandemic has showed, just with the dashboards, without going into the negative criticisms of that, I think we have democratized data more. I think we have democratized epidemiology, Chris. You'll be pleased to know everybody's an epidemiologist now. There is a flip side to this, which is what we've also seen. People use it to their own means without necessarily trying to develop new knowledge or portray the truth, as it were. And I think the administrative boundaries, on a positive side, I think the technology that we have so now will sort of transcend all the changes in the administrative boundaries, but it needs design. It won't happen by default. So say when Cumbria changes, the way that the reports get changed, it will change. But I think as we have much more dynamic and much more connected communities, there's definitely something about connected data at an individual level. And I think this also makes it the point. I think it makes the point for me. People need to start owning their data more and being empowered to share, and the technology is there to share. But I think this is where all this democratization of technology and data, certainly the secondary uses in terms of what's happening in my community and people like me and all of that, is so powerful actually to change behaviors. But it's a fantastic point.
Okay, now I'm just going to finish off by handing back to Karen, coming back to her earlier point about leadership, because she can maybe summarize a bit with her point about leadership and finish off on that role where you finished your talk as well, Sakthi, I think. But before I do that, I'll just say thank you from me as well. Fantastic talk, really enjoyed it. And thank you for everyone who's contributed all the wonderful questions, and the recording as well. It's going to be fantastically valuable. So Karen, I'll hand back to you. And, you did ask about leadership, and I'll hand back to you as our leader. So thank you.
Thank you. Thanks. Yeah. And I mean, it was more of a comment, really, just that I found what you were saying about leadership, straightforward, but really incredibly wise. And what I picked out was the issue about character and knowledge. And obviously, I'm not going to say anything about the current national situation, but I think we've learned that character is really important alongside knowledge. I was also really interested in the point you made about, leaders really needing to get on with each other and to kind of, set aside competing agendas or differences to be kind of mature enough in a way to do that, and to, to pull together. And obviously I work a lot with justice systems and children's services, and have seen a lot of that going on firsthand during the pandemic that wasn't there before, you know, where there was a lot of territory and turf wars beforehand. When people dropped that, was really powerful in terms of local solutions and flexibility. Cultivating a multidisciplinary mindset, yes, and seeing the problem broadly, because I often think what we see and understand is demand on individual services, which doesn't equate to the nature of difficulties in family life. So, you know, a glaring example for me is looking at the drivers of female offending are exactly the same drivers of mental health or of involvement in children's services. But, you know, we see them almost as like separate issues because of the way in which our systems are siloed. So on that note, I mean, and just picking up on Chris's point, it will be really great to see more regional cooperation between the universities and public services to kind of make use of these very rich data assets that are available, whatever we can do to, I mean, at the university, we've been building up our secure data science infrastructure, Nige, haven't we? And that's partly with a view to, you know, entering into these regional relationships where we can have sort of reciprocal relationships of mutual exchange that aren't necessarily about headline grabbing or anything like that. They're really about mutual cooperation, but having this shared intelligence across boundaries to be able to do that. Because at the moment, my view is, and huge frustration, yeah, we've got ONS, we've got very centralized, often bottlenecks really around data. But the barriers that stand in the way of us actually cooperating at regional level are just really unhelpful. And we've got skills, expertise, public services are rich with data. There's a relationship to be forged there that was incredibly productive. So whatever we can do, Chris, to, you know, kind of bang the drum around getting rid of the red tape and inspiring confidence as well in the public around safe use of data for the public good. So yeah, that's me done now, Bruce. But I just wanted to say thanks as well for a fascinating talk. It's really, 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 really enriching to hear you speak about the pandemic, you know, from that frontline perspective. It's great.
You're
so
welcome.
Bruce.
I mean, me.
Okay, so I think that draws us to a close now. Oh yeah, bang on. Hey, look, 4:30. So can I just thank the audience today? Thank you so much for joining us. It's been a really good, really, really great event, and the discussion incredibly rich and interesting. And we look forward to many more of these talks and further cooperation, Sakthi, with you and with Public Health Lancashire. Okay, so thank you, everybody. And we'll just give one quick more round of applause, I think.
Thank you. Thank you for I look forward to more collaborations going forward.
Yeah.
Thanks all.
Thank you.